Welcome back. So in this set of lectures, I'm going to talk through the main points of the deep ecology movement as expressed in the 1973 paper by Arne Ness. You've already yourself done some work on this in the reading response, and you've also thought a bit about whether you agree or disagree with these items. So I will speak a little bit as we go about what the reasons might be to agree or disagree with these points or principles or commitments of the deep ecology movement. The first of these principles is something that Ness describes as rejection of the man and environment image in favor of the relational total field image. And the basic idea here, based on the paragraph description that we get in the 1973 article, is that the deep ecology movement favors a much more relational view of human beings and of life and of organisms and of nature as a whole than some other traditional ways of thinking about those things. So this is also described by Ness as thinking of organisms as knots in the biospherical net, or field of intrinsic relations. Some of what's going on in the background here is that Ness is appealing to a traditional distinction in philosophy that's actually something ends up being the source of something of a controversy among philosophers. The contrast is between what are sometimes called extrinsic relations or external relations and intrinsic relations or internal relations. The basic distinction here is that some kinds of relations between things don't affect the nature of the things that are related. So if you take two apples and you put them both on a table, they're related in that they're both on the same table or they're a certain distance from each other. But those relations don't affect the nature or the identity of the apples themselves. On the other hand, some kinds of relation between things actually affect the nature of the thing. So think about the relation between the value of money and the price of commodities. The value of money changes based on the price of commodities. And so those two things are internally related because changes to one or the relation between the two is part of what defines each of them. And so there's a long-standing controversy in philosophy about basically whether the world things should be thought of more in terms of being externally related to one another or intrinsically related to one another. So here's a classic type of view about the world that really emphasizes extrinsic relations. In the sciences, some people and people who really read the sciences and want to think about the world in a really scientific way sometimes think that reality is composed of particles, and these particles are in interactions with each other. They're related to one another in accordance with laws of physics and chemistry. And those interactions at a subatomic level are what produce structures that take the structures that are operative at the atomic level, and then structures of relations at the atomic level are what produce what's operative above the atomic level, like for instance with tables and chairs and living things and anything else that we can directly see or experience. And that is a kind of building block view of the world, so that the whole world, what happens in the world, happens because of the configuration of the elementary particles, that is where they are and how they're related to each other, and the laws that govern their interactions. But notice that on that picture, you can, in theory at least, explain or predict everything that happens based on the placement of the subatomic particles and the laws that govern the interactions between the particles. So nothing that happens there, I mean, the subatomic particles themselves don't have to be defined relationally, according to this conception. And so that's a view that thinks of the whole world as sort of built out of smallest parts, and the relations between the smallest parts don't affect the natures of the smallest parts. And so that's a view that's completely thinking of the world in terms of extrinsic relations. Views that think of the world in terms of intrinsic relations might question, if they're going to talk about the physics and chemistry part of it, they might question whether even the subatomic particles really can be identified or known independent of their relations to other subatomic particles. And so there actually is there are some positions in the interpretation of quantum physics that emphasize intrinsic relations more than extrinsic relations. But in terms of more everyday examples, it's a question of whether you think that, like, if you think about people, you could think, like, are people who they are basically because of their own decisions? And if they're in interaction with other people, if they're on a team, then what happens in the team is just a matter of, like, what each individual in the team decides and does, and how they respond to what other individuals in the team do. And the total aggregate of that is what produces what happens in the team. Or do you think of teams rather as something where each individual in the team is actually, it is something different if they're part of the team than if they aren't. That each individual on the team, their individual character, what they're bringing to the table, or what they are, it can be defined in part by their membership in the team. So, like, if you think that if it makes sense to say that when someone joins an organization, that their identity changes. It's not just that they're now related to an organization in a different way, but that just by being a part of that organization now, because of that relation, they're a different person. Then you're allowing that there can be that there is an intrinsic relation there, that the identity of the person is defined in part by their relations to other things. Now, with this first principle or commitment of deep ecology, Ness, interestingly, is taking a position about this longstanding controversy. And he's saying we ought to think about ourselves and about other parts of nature as intrinsically related to other parts of nature rather than merely extrinsically related. So he's saying that nature, at least, is much more a matter of intrinsic relations rather than extrinsic ones, or at least that we ought to think of it that way.